If you read the accounts of Jesus in the Bible, you notice there's a big gap. Jesus' birth is recounted in Luke and Matthew. And Luke has the incident we heard today where when Jesus was 12 years old, he went with his parents to Jerusalem. But other than that, the Bible tells us nothing about Jesus until he is approximately 30 years of age and comes upon the public scene. And so the early years of Jesus, except for that one little incident reported in Luke, are complete mystery, the first 30 years of his life. But there is one early Christian writing that did not make it into the Bible that says it tells things about Jesus' childhood. And I was talking to somebody about this, and they said, well, I'd like to hear about this. And so it is what is called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Now, this is not the same thing as the Gospel of Thomas that used to be popular back 5 or 10 years ago. This is the Infancy Gospel. Now, keep in mind, this is not in the Bible, so we can't, really put too much stock in it. However, it is very old. The first time we see it mentioned is in the year 180 in the writings of a Christian named Irenaeus. So he quotes from it. So we know it was in existence before the year 180 and was at least highly regarded at that time that Irenaeus quoted from it. Now keep in mind, the Bible as we know it would not be put together for another almost 200 years. So the Bible as we know it had not yet been compiled. Now, many biblical scholars have studied this writing and feel that it was written at about the same time as the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they're not sure. But we know it's very early. Now, it claims to have been written by a man called Thomas the Israelite. He identifies himself as an apostle of Jesus. And if you remember, Jesus did have a disciple or apostle named Thomas. He's better known as Doubting Thomas. But that does not necessarily mean this is that Thomas. Many Christians at that time called themselves apostles. You remember Paul called himself an apostle, and he was not one of the 12 disciples. So just because Thomas calls himself an apostle does not mean he is claiming to be one of Jesus' 12 disciples. Now, Thomas indicates in this writing that he is writing for a non-Jewish audience, and that is not surprising because Christianity never made headway among the Jews. It was a non-Jewish religion. Now, this book contains accounts of Jesus as a child. Now, if you'll remember in the Gospel of Matthew, how after Jesus was born, an angel appeared in a dream to Joseph and told him that Herod would try to kill the baby Jesus and that he, Mary, and Jesus should go into Egypt. And we hear how that is what they did. And Matthew doesn't tell us how long they were there. It just tells us that when Herod died, they came back. But the Infancy Gospel of Thomas says that they were there 5 years. And that when Jesus was 5 years old, he, Mary, and Joseph moved back to Nazareth. Now, here are some of the incidents this Infancy Gospel relates. The first one happened when Jesus was 5 years old. It had rained one day, and there was muddy water running around from the rain. And Jesus went out and he made a little pool so he could play in the mud. And he was out there, he got tired of it being muddy, so he just commanded the water to get clear, and it cleared up. And then out of the clay, the mud laying around other places, he got it and he made 12 little clay birds. Now, it happened to be the Sabbath, and you're not supposed to do stuff like that on the Sabbath. Other children had seen that Jesus had done that on the Sabbath. You know how children like to be tattletaled. So they went and tattled to Jesus, to his parents, that Jesus is out there making little birds on the Sabbath. So Joseph came out and he said, Jesus, why did you do this on the Sabbath? And Jesus didn't pay Joseph any attention. He turned to the clay birds and told them to fly, and they immediately became real birds, and they flew off. And other people were standing around watching this, and they saw it, and they were astonished. And then there was a little boy standing there. He was a Pharisee. Remember in the Gospel, Jesus did come on with Pharisees, and this Pharisee little boy, he didn't think Jesus should be playing on the Sabbath. So he took a stick, and he dug like a little trench there to drain the pool. And this made Jesus mad. And Jesus looked at the little boy and he said, you will wither away. And the boy dropped over dead. Now the other children saw this, and they ran to the boy's father, and the father went to Joseph and confronted him with it. He couldn't do anything about it. Well, a little bit later, Joseph and Jesus were walking down the road one day, and there were some other children there, and they remembered how Jesus had killed this other little boy. So one of his children picked up a rock and threw it at Jesus, and it hit Jesus on the shoulder. And Jesus turned around and said, you will not finish your course. And the child fell dead. People confronted Joseph, and they said, if you don't do something to bring him under control, you're going to have to leave town. Jesus was killing their children. And so Joseph told Jesus to stand in front of him, and he grabbed a hold of one of Jesus' ears, and he pinched and twisted it until it got sore. And he told him he'd have to stop doing those things. And Jesus said, okay, I'll stop, but I'm going to make everybody who griped about me pay. And so all of a sudden, all those who had griped to Joseph about what Jesus had done went blind. And this made Joseph really mad. He grabbed Jesus' ear again and started to pinch it. And Jesus told him to release his ear and that he'd better not ever do it again. Now there was a man named Zacchaeus who was a teacher who heard all this about Jesus. And he came to Joseph and he said, why don't you send Jesus to me? I might can teach him to do better. Jesus laughed at Zacchaeus and says, I know more about you do. I even know how long you would live. I know how the world was created. And Jesus began to ask Zacchaeus questions that Zacchaeus could not answer. Others were standing by, and he says they saw this and were amazed at all these things Jesus knew. But they were also upset because Jesus knew so much. Zacchaeus tried to teach Jesus, but Jesus knew so much more than he did that it was useless. He said it brought shame on himself. Other people felt sorry for Zacchaeus and tried to console him, and Jesus laughed about it though. Jesus said, however, I will undo all the bad things I've done to other people. The children he killed came back to life. Those who he made blind were able to see again. And it said that everybody was scared to death of Jesus. A little bit later, Jesus was playing with some other boys on the roof of the house, and one of them fell off, and he died. And Jesus went over and brought him back to life. And it says the people glorified God for Jesus bringing the boy back to life. A few days later, a young man was out chopping wood. The axe slipped, and he cut his foot, and he was going to bleed to death. Jesus was there, and he ran over and touched the man's foot, and immediately it was healed. A crowd had gathered, and they told Jesus, we believe you are God. One day, Mary asked Jesus to go out and fetch water, but on the way out there to the well, he fell, and the water jug broke. But he took his coat off, and he filled it with water, and it says that Mary was amazed at how he was able to make his coat hold water. There's another incident related where Joseph and Jesus go out to sow wheat. And Joseph sows wheat all day. And Jesus drops one little kernel in. And it said that at harvest time, he harvested 100 measures of wheat from just this one kernel. And he took it and he gave it to all the poor people in town. Now remember, Jesus and Joseph were carpenters. And one time, a man had hired Joseph to make him a table. And when he assembled it, he found out that he had cut one of the pieces of wood too short. So Jesus told him not to worry about it. Went over there and grabbed onto the piece of wood and stretched it out to the right length. Now shortly after this, Joseph decided to try sending Jesus to another teacher. He wanted to send Jesus to this teacher so Jesus could learn to read and write Greek. The teacher hesitated. He had heard of Jesus and was afraid of him. But Jesus went anyway. Jesus did with this teacher just as he did with Zacchaeus. The teacher got mad at him and hit Jesus on the head. And at that point, Jesus cursed him and the man fell over dead. Jesus then went back home, and Mary and Joseph decided they wouldn't let him out of the house anymore. Now, a while later, another teacher came up and wanted to take Jesus as a student. He said that he could do it without provoking him. And so he took Jesus, and when Jesus got to the school there were others there, and Jesus began teaching them. And it says that everyone was amazed at Jesus' teaching. And Joseph was scared to death, though, that something bad would happen. The teacher, though, told Joseph, I have nothing to teach him. He is wiser than I am. And he said that Joseph should take Jesus back home. Jesus told the teacher that since you recognize this, I will bring back to life the other teacher whom I killed. And so he did. Now Jesus had a brother named James, and one day James went out to get straw for the fire. And when he reached down into the pile of straw, a poisonous snake bit him. And it said Jesus went up and breathed on the bite, and immediately James was healed. But the snake exploded. Now sometime later, a little child in the area got sick and died. And Jesus heard about this and went to where the child was and brought it back to life. And then afterwards, he just started playing with the other children. It was one day some men were working on a building. An accident happened and one of the workmen was killed. Jesus went and brought him back to life. And now people changed their minds about Jesus and started praising him because he was doing so much good. The final incident that happened in the infancy narrative of Thomas is the one that we heard in Luke about how Mary and Joseph took Jesus to Jerusalem. Now the accounts in this infancy gospel of Thomas may not be what you expected. Jesus, we see him as a young child. He has a temper, and he hurts people. He kills people. Now, of course, eventually, everybody that he killed or hurt, he restored and brought back to life. And we also see Jesus bringing a lot of dead people back to life. We see Jesus working miracles. We see Jesus carrying water in his coat. We see him stretching out pieces of wood. We see him healing snake bites and cuts. We see that Jesus had knowledge that exceeded even the best teachers when he was only 5 or 6 years old. These are the exact things we see in the Gospels. One of the main things in the infancy Gospel of Thomas is how people were amazed and astounded at the things Jesus was able to do. We see that theme throughout the Gospels in the Bible. Over and over in the Gospels it says how people were amazed. We see Jesus having more knowledge than the teachers. We see in the Gospels how it says that the people were amazed at his teaching, at his knowledge. In our Gospel reading today, we see when Jesus is sitting there with the scribes in the temple, it says that they were amazed at his knowledge and understanding. We also see in the infancy Gospel of Thomas how people were afraid because they were seeing things that they couldn't understand. And we see that in the Gospels also. There is an incident where Jesus cast a herd of demons out of a man, and they run into a herd of pigs, and the pigs run off a cliff, and it says that the people in that town are so afraid that they ask Jesus to leave. We see the same thing other places in the Gospels where Jesus performs a miracle and people are scared and they ask him to leave. The Gospels report that people are afraid of Jesus. It reports that Jesus took a whip and ran the money changers out of the temple. And then it says that the Jews were afraid of Jesus. We see these same things in the infancy Gospel of Thomas. These things of amazement and fear are present both in the Gospels in the Bible and the infancy Gospel of Thomas. We might get upset at Jesus cursing children and teachers and killing them, but remember in the Gospels there is that incident where Jesus is walking by one morning, he's hungry, and he wants a fig. He looks over at the fig tree, and there's no fig on it. And the Bible tells us that it's not even fig season, and Jesus gets mad, and he curses that fig tree, and then we see the next day they walk by, and it's dead. Wasn't Jesus always so kind and good, we think? Remember, in many of the parables of Jesus, people are delivered to the torturers. They are delivered where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. They are standing in front of the door, and the person responsible for opening the door refuses to open it. So you see, if you look at some of the things in the Bible and the Gospels, it's not really that much different. We see Jesus telling the Pharisees that they are sons of Satan, vipers. They don't understand anything about God. We see Jesus telling the Pharisees that they are such transgressors of the commandments that they deserve to die. And so really, although what we see in this infancy Gospel of Thomas is a little different than what we would have thought, when you really think about it and analyze it, and then go analyze what we see about Jesus in the Gospels, it's not all that much different. So what do we do with it? Is it true? You know, obviously it was around not all that many years after the life of Jesus. That doesn't necessarily mean it's true, though. I don't know if it's true or not. It is a very ancient Christian writing. When you think about it, when Jesus was a child, there must have been something different from between him and other children. You know, we just can't imagine. I think it would be unrealistic of us to think of Jesus as a child and being just like every other child. There is a hint in the Gospel of John that Mary, the mother of Jesus, had experienced doing things that were out of the ordinary. The first miracle ascribed to Jesus in the Gospel of John is he and his mother and family were at a wedding and they ran out of wine. And Jesus told them to fill the water jars completely up, and he turned all of that into wine. Now, before that happened, though, Mary has an interesting thing to say. She says to the people there at the wedding, do whatever he tells you to do. Now, that right there would indicate that even though this was the first public miracle Jesus did, that Mary must have had some kind of experience with Jesus doing unusual and out of the ordinary things earlier, because she told the men at the wedding, do whatever he tells you to do. This indicates that Mary knew that Jesus could do something that other people couldn't do. And it indicates that there very, very well had been incidents from Jesus' earlier years where he did extraordinary things too. So, we don't take the infancy gospel of Thomas the same way as we do the Bible. But it is an old, old writing that was around in the days of ancient Christianity. And I think it is very interesting. It gives us at least a glimpse into what the early life of Jesus could have been like. And although it's not what maybe we would have expected to see, when you really look at it, it's not all that much different than the gospel.